The Passion of Christ, a deep dive into his final hours. It was a quiet evening in Jerusalem, and the disciples gathered with Jesus for what would become their final meal together. The Passover celebration was a time of joy, but there was an unusual tension in the air. Jesus, aware of what was to come, looked around the room at the faces of his closest friends. He knew their hearts were troubled, yet they could not fully grasp what lay ahead. "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me," Jesus said as he broke the bread and passed it to them. He then lifted a cup of wine, saying, "This is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." His words were heavy with meaning. His death was imminent. As the meal ended, Jesus and the disciples walked to the Garden of Gethsemane. It was a place where Jesus often prayed, but this time was different. Falling to his knees, he prayed with a burdened heart. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." The weight of what was to come crushed him: betrayal, suffering, and death. His sweat, like drops of blood, fell to the ground as he wrestled with the enormity of the sacrifice he was about to make: the betrayal and arrest. While Jesus prayed, a figure emerged from the darkness. Judas Iscariot, one of his own disciples, approached with a group of soldiers. He stepped forward and greeted Jesus with a kiss, the signal of betrayal. "Friend, do what you came for," Jesus said calmly. Knowing his arrest was inevitable, the soldiers seized Jesus, and the disciples, overwhelmed by fear, fled into the night. Even Peter, who had vowed never to leave him, ran in fear. Jesus was taken to the high priest's house where his trials began. He stood silently before his accusers as they hurled false charges against him. When asked directly if he was the Son of God, Jesus replied, "You have said so." His words sealed his fate. The religious leaders condemned him for blasphemy, and they handed him over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, seeking the death penalty. The trial before Pilate. At dawn, Jesus stood before Pilate, a Roman official who seemed reluctant to execute him. "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world." Though Pilate found no fault in him, the crowd outside was relentless. "Crucify him," they shouted. Pilate, fearing an uprising, washed his hands before the crowd and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood." He gave in to their demands and ordered Jesus to be scourged and crucified. The soldiers mocked Jesus, dressing him in a purple robe and pressing a crown of thorns onto his head. They spat on him and struck him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" But Jesus endured it all silently, fulfilling the prophecy that the Messiah would suffer for the sins of humanity. The road to Calvary. With a wooden cross placed on his torn back, Jesus was led through the streets of Jerusalem toward the place of his execution, Golgotha, the place of the skull. Weak from the brutal scourging, Jesus stumbled under the weight of the cross. The soldiers pulled a man from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross for him. Along the way, women wept for Jesus, but he turned to them and said, "Do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and your children." Even in his suffering, Jesus showed compassion for others. The Crucifixion. At Golgotha, soldiers nailed Jesus' hands and feet to the cross. 2 criminals were crucified beside him, one on his right and one on his left. As they mocked him, Jesus looked to the heavens and prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." A sign above his head read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Some laughed, saying, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." But Jesus stayed, enduring the agony. Hours passed as the weight of the world's sin bore down on him. One of the criminals beside him asked, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus, with love even in his final moments, replied, "Today, you will be with me in paradise." The death of the Savior at noon, darkness fell over the land. The earth trembled as Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, he bore the full weight of humanity's sin, feeling the separation from his Father. With a final breath, he declared, "It is finished." Jesus had completed his mission. He bowed his head and surrendered his spirit. The ground shook violently, and the temple curtain was torn in two, symbolizing that the barrier between God and humanity had been removed, the aftermath and burial. A Roman centurion, witnessing the events, exclaimed, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Many who had mocked him now stood in awe and fear. Jesus' body was taken down from the cross by Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy follower, and wrapped in linen